Crypt of the NecroDancer was made available for home computers in 2015, but console re-releases right up to 2018 have kept it fresh in players' minds. It's a must-play title for fans of VGM for several reasons, from its Danny Baranowsky soundtrack to its inventive mix of roguelike dungeon crawling with rhythm game mechanics. Danny's music was well known from games like Binding of Isaac, which has a previous episode in this series, and Super Meat Boy, so Crypt of the NecroDancer was an exciting prospect for a new set of his tunes alone. The gameplay itself turned out to be just as addictive and fun as Danny's soundtrack, and it can now be enjoyed on PS4, PS Vita, Xbox One, Nintendo Switch, and even through Apple's App Store. Many of Danny Baranowski's tracks for Crypt of the NecroDancer feature Jules Conroy, also known as Family Jules 7X, on guitar. The two first worked together for the Binding of Isaac's Wrath of the Lamb expansion, but NecroDancer shows just how far they've come. Jules made covers of NecroDancer material, initially just for fun, which impressed Danny so much that an entire alternate soundtrack was commissioned to focus on his guitars. Used for the challenging character Aria, the remixed OST from Jules matched the pressure of her extreme difficulty. From that, the idea spawned to include more remixes, leading to another soundtrack by EDM producer A Rival, and a further 5 at least to accompany DLCs, localizations, and console ports. The replayability they allow for is astounding, but they probably also form the most collaborative musical project for a game to date. I'm Lee Tyrrell, and this is the Sound Test, where I look in depth into video game audio and music along with the very people who crafted it. Bearing in mind the general production on this series, 15 interviews to conduct, and my own personal life, speaking to everyone involved with Crypt of the NecroDancer's various soundtracks was basically impossible. However, I'm very pleased to welcome back to the show the man whose music is at the centre of it all, Danny Baranowsky. In this episode, we'll also hear some significant insight from Jules Conroy of Family Jules 7X, who talks us through his contributions to the game and his history with VGM. Along the way, I'll try to stop off and talk a bit about NecroDancer's other great music, but let's start with Danny's involvement in the project. With his compositions as closely tied to the gameplay as it is, was it something he was in on from the beginning?
It was extremely early. It was a very simple prototype, so not. I think there was like 1 or 2 tracks. There was another composer, Alec Aloka. He recently just won an award for Night in the Woods. He was on there originally. He left later on, but there was a few tracks by him that they were just using to kind of put in there and test it out. There was a flag in the ground. Like it was clear what the game wanted to be and what it was there for, but it was at a very primitive state.
Alec Aloka is a noted indie game developer who often works on the music for his games too. As Danny mentioned, he's award-winning and highly respected. So did any of his composition for NecroDancer stick after he left its development? And how much did things change when Danny came on board?
So none of the crossfadey stuff had even been considered. The one thing that Alec did come up with that was really cool and is still in there is the missing 8th beat on King Konga. So yeah, he came up with that in his initial track, and when I took over, I kind of did the same thing because it was a good idea. Why not? It kind of evolved over time, over like how much crazy stuff and interactive stuff we were going to try to do, like the Shopkeeper.
Crypt of the NecroDancer's memorable Shopkeeper sings his operatic heart out as you near him and enter his store. The Shopkeeper is a particularly favourite feature of many fans, and his singing actually helps with gameplay by acting as an oral breadcrumb trail. but he was once far quieter than we know him now.
Initially, the shopkeeper was just standing there, and there was a sound effect of him just going like ooh ooh ooh, and like little notes coming out of him and stuff. Then Ryan Clark, the big boy at Brace Yourself, he came out to just chill for a couple days at my house to like work on some stuff. We got drunk. He taught me how to play Dwarf Fortress on my projector. So like each of those little ASCII characters was like 4 inches tall. It was really cool, and I still have no idea how to play that fucking game. But anyway, we were just drinking, having a good time, and we go up to the studio. It's like, hey, let's try to just work on something. I think I was just like playing it, and the shopkeeper was like, why don't we just make him like sing? He's like, I don't know, let's try it. And so I just put on my headphones and did the 1-1 track. I just found like the cheesiest tenor opera singer patch on Omnisphere I could. Just did it. Just wrote another melody, put it on there, and showed him. He laughed his ass off, and okay, there it is. Then I was like, okay, well, how do we integrate it? And we thought about, well, it should be directional. We should filter it so it sounds like when you open the door, just to be kind of as correct orally, audio-wise as you could. And then we kind of just realized, hey, if you listen for the shopkeeper, you can echolocate him. Like a lot of things, I just did it because I thought it was funny. Like I was just having a good time. Like it makes me wonder how many game mechanics like have that much thought in them, and it's just like, no, I think in Zelda your weapon should break because it's funny. Like, no, actually that's really good.
There's a point where a soundtrack and a release's actual mechanics cross over and influence one another. In the case of Crypt of the NecroDancer, this is more pronounced. It operates like many other dungeon crawlers, but you're penalised if your actions don't match the beat, and rewarded when they do. Were there any other examples where the music and the gameplay affected each other to bring something new to the experience?
The choral riff boss, I think, I don't want to take credit because I'm sure he was thinking about it before, but like just the idea of like having the different instruments when they die, that stem of the music gets killed, and then when he comes back with all his arms again, all the music comes back. The closest thing that would be that is just like determining which tempos the tracks would be at. We had thought about doing some stuff where it's just like, okay, well, let's say it's on a like duh 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 duh. Well, let's make it go to that instead of just locked on the beats, and make it so you have to move to these patterns. But it just never felt good. Like there's a reason why the only level in the game where there's like the beat is anything but 100% there is that King Konga boss, is because it just never really felt fair or right. Okay, you have to move to this rhythm, duh 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 duh. And it was already hard enough to get people to like feel the beat and like get in there that it just felt like really frustrating and stuff. So that was about the extent of it.
Danny's music for Crypt of the NecroDancer doesn't jump too deep into complex time signatures or polyrhythms, because the game would suffer as a result. Many musicians struggle with demanding rhythms, so asking gamers to keep up with them would simply ruin the flow. However, it's important that the soundtrack progress and move into more complicated territory. Learning curves help to define structuring in video games, and there are many ways the music can support that.
Tempo is the kind of the obvious one, but just additional internal complexity as far as syncopation for sure. The later ones definitely get more syncopated. 4-3 was initially like this trance style track that was going to be level 1-4, but then we started making all the worlds only 3 levels instead of 4, so that track was just kind of orphaned. People in the early access and stuff liked that song and they missed that song, so I'm like, all right, well, I got to bring it back. And so I did just a very, you kind of have to like move your body to know where the beat is for sure. You know, and the bosses, it was a little harder to do because the bosses can appear in a random order, so I couldn't do that too much. And then it was just a function of they would tell me how complex the mechanics were going to be, and it was like, well, if the mechanics are already this complex, it's going to be this hard, I can't layer on. Or if they're like, well, this part's pretty easy, so we can layer on, right? So it was just, again, I firmly believe you have to defer to the game design to make good game music, and so that was kind of always the guiding principle there.
Since meeting Jules Conroy through a guitar cover of Super Meat Boy's Hospital theme, Danny has made use of his tight playing. The two can first be heard together on Binding of Isaac's My Innermost Apocalypse, and their working relationship has proved so fruitful that Jules appears on 5 of Danny's NecroDancer tracks, not counting their Shopkeeper variations. Of course, Jules provided his own separate OST with Aria's Ascent, a metal twist on Danny's approach. But what's their process when they pair up?
I'm a big believer in if you hire an instrumentalist, lean on their expertise, right? Like when I see recording sessions where like producers, this is a very general example, but like when producers try to over coach instrumentalists and not, you know, like you're the one who's played guitar forever and I'm not. Like, so I'm going to tell you like what the broad level stuff I need is, but like I'm going to try to defer to you as much as I can because that's why you're here, right? Like you're not a monkey in a cage. You're like a human being with musical expression and stuff.
Danny's very open-minded about stuff. Like, he really trusted me with guitar sounds and stuff, but he knew how the song was going to sound. You know, he knew what that song needed to sound like, and, you know, I respected that because I also, you know, like, there was rarely ever a time, I don't think there ever was a time that I heard a song that he was writing and I was like, oh, like, that's a weird thing. I would do something differently. Like, you know, like everything he wrote, like, I covered his music because I love his music, you know. There wasn't really any time that I felt that I necessarily wanted to add anything because I thought the way that he wrote the guitar parts really served the song in like a really, really cool and good way. Yeah, I don't really think that there ever was a time that I was maybe there was a time where I was just like, that is really awkward on guitar, could I change it to maybe like this octave or this scale degree or something like that. And, you know, usually he'd slap me across the face with a ruler and say, no, do it my way. No, I'm just kidding. No, he didn't do that. But no, it was very easygoing. But I mean, yeah, I didn't really require a whole lot of creative freedom for that because it was already all written, you know.
It sounds like the two are comfortable with each other and confident in their roles, which is surely why they've continued collaborating over the years. The precise story of how they came together is a testament to the power of the internet and social media, and you can hear it from both their perspectives in the previous Binding of Isaac episode of this series. Funnily enough, the facts behind Aria's Ascent are strangely similar. It so easily couldn't have happened, but a little initiative from Jules snowballed into the huge, multi-artist soundtrack we now enjoy.
I went out, I can't remember why I went out. I think this was when NecroDancer was in alpha, you know, it wasn't even announced yet, I don't think. But he was like, hey, I'm working on this really wacky rhythm game. And he showed it to like a whole room of people, and I heard that first track. I think I just asked him, I was just like, hey, I really like that music, could you send me the demos that you got of that stuff? And he was like, sure, but don't, you know, obviously don't share them and stuff like that. And I was like, okay. because I was planning on doing covers of it, just to, because like I really liked it and I thought it would sound really good on guitar. Mostly I just wanted to hear how it would sound, and then I was just like, hey, maybe at some point I can cover this stuff on YouTube, and then I'll have a cover already done of it, I did the first one, I had a blast, and I did the second one, I had a blast, and then I did the third one, and the third one was really difficult, but I also had a blast, and I didn't tell him that I was doing any of this, I just kind of did it. And one day I called up Danny, I was like, hey Danny, I got a surprise for you. And he's like, alright, what do you got, Jules? I sent him the first one, and he was just like, holy shit, like, this is awesome. And I was just like, I also have the second one. And he's just like, what the hell? He listened to it, he liked it, he was just like, whoa, like, what the hell, how many of these do you have? And I was just like, I have another one, so I sent him the third one.
Jules we became friends pretty quick after the Isaac thing, and he was at my house for PAX one year, and he leaves, and he says, I got something for you, but I can't show you. I'm like, all right, what do you want? What And so, like, shortly after PAX, he sends me 1-1, 1-2, and 1-3 done in metal, just crossfadeable. And he's just like, I just did them for fun. Maybe you could have alternate tracks in there. And it was just like, dude, these are amazing. Wow. And he kind of just sparked that whole idea of having alternate crossfadeable soundtracks.
In what was likely one of VGM's best eureka moments, Jules laid the groundwork for a bigger concept that may still have some new branches to come. Theoretically, Crypt of the NecroDancer's OST could just keep growing, with both Danny and Jules at its very roots. Jules is quite modest about his part in the concept, but there's no denying that he helped light the fire.
I mean, it was his idea, man. Like, I just wanted to cover the music because I thought it would sound cool, but he was like, what if you were to do the whole soundtrack? I think this was an idea that he had previously with another game, that he wanted to have like an alternate soundtrack, and it didn't really work out. So he was really excited that this kind of just, I'm sure he was excited that this like fell in his lap, because, I was just like, hey, I'm here, I'm doing it, like I'm doing it whether you want me to or not. And he was just like, how cool would it be if we just had like an alternate metal soundtrack? And then, he was thinking, like, what else could we do? Oh my god, like, and it was all just like kind of coming together. He's just like, man, we should get a rival to do like an EDM soundtrack.
We had done it before in Isaac, but I kind of just like, with how much music there was, it didn't seem appropriate, and I was like, I'm not gonna have time to do all this. But it's like, well, if somebody else does them, okay. And so then it was just basic. Then we decided to have two alternate soundtracks to start, and we chose the other one. We chose a rival who lives up here, old school remixer and stuff.
A Rival has been involved in the VGM remix community for years, but he also releases completely original material through a number of outlets. Jules and A Rival recorded the only alternate soundtracks at first, with the others coming out later. Jake Kaufman put forth a very cool stripped back version with improvised elements, which came at the same time as an 80s synthwave interpretation from multiple Girlfriend Records artists. The Amplified DLC featured another, this time coaxing out a multitude of overclocked remix talents. Next, Chipsaw offered a retro take on NecroDancer's sounds, while a Japanese localization did away with Danny's tunes in favour of music from a different series altogether. I haven't played the Nintendo Switch edition, and there's all sorts of conflicting information online, but there's apparently stuff on there from the Groove Coaster series, a rhythmic Space Invaders spin-off. Discounting the soundtracks that use material from other games, how did Danny guide alternate music that brims with individuality, but obeys the simple rules necessary to fit the game?
I tried to honestly be as hands-off as possible. Just say, these, it's got to be crossfadeable, it's got to be the right tempo, it's got to work with the Shopkeeper. So seeing that happen was very, very cool. And a lot of the other musicians, the Girlfriend Records guys, did some really creative stuff. Ultimately, there's 6 additional soundtracks. So I had to go through and, listen through and approve 6 times a billion, there was just 10 hours of music or something now. And so it was kind of exhaustive in that way. And it was also, it's one thing to be like, one person does a remix and you give them your thoughts on it. It's another thing to entire soundtrack. But it worked out really well. And they did things that I never would have thought of. And no, it was a really interesting experience.
Soon, we'll hear some thoughts from Danny and Jules about the creation of Aria's Ascent. First, let's pause for some background. When I interviewed Jules, I got the chance to ask him about his history with music and games. I was interested in his evolution from being a fan to a prominent remixer, to eventually arranging Danny's music into an official alternate soundtrack.
I can't even remember when I played my first game ever, but I do know it was the Duck Hunt Super Mario Bros. Cartridge for the NES, early 90s at some point. It wasn't until probably 96 or 97 that I got a Nintendo 64, and I delved very deeply into Super Mario 64, much to my mom's dismay. GoldenEye 007, and a lot of those games and stuff. But I think the first time the music really struck me in games, it was it had to have been Banjo-Kazooie or Mario 64, because those games had such memorable tracks that got stuck in your head, because they were so well composed, and you spent so long in these worlds having them drilled in your head. It wasn't long until these songs in video games were replacing the songs that I was listening to on the radio for songs that I wanted to listen to.
That sentiment is exactly why I make the sound test. As popular music has slowly diminished into a shadow of its former self, listeners turn to games instead of the charts or the radio. It happened to me. Even as a youth, I could tell that VGM was pushing boundaries and sounding great while doing so. Composers like Danny Baranowsky are a prime example of game musicians still holding the torch for innovation and melodic joy. Jules apparently shares my view, but it wasn't immediately obvious to him to adapt those tunes to the guitar.
So I picked up a guitar probably 7th or 8th grade, and at that time I wasn't really playing too many video games, so I was playing stuff like, just like acoustic, butt rock music and stuff. But it wasn't until I think I picked up F-Zero X again, after loving that game as a kid too, that I was just like, man, this would be great to learn how to play someday, try to learn how to play all these blistering guitar lines and stuff. And that became a goal of mine, to learn how to play. And eventually I could, and I think that kind of started getting me down the path of making video game music on guitar. Those are probably the sparks.
A fair amount of the tracks that Jules transferred to guitar when he first began come from the first few handheld Pokemon games. His library has become stocked with adaptations from almost every corner of gaming since, but those Pokemon covers, amongst others, set out his store and got his foot in the door. By virtue of the way they were written, Pokemon's melodies were perfect practice for future guitar arrangements.
So, Junichi Masuda wrote the music to the first Pokemon game, and then he collaborated, I think, with Go Ichinose for the music for Pokemon Gold and Silver. Back then, you only were limited, especially on the Game Boy, to essentially 2 lead lines, a bass line, and then, a PCM channel for, drums and percussion and stuff. That lends itself beautifully to remixing, because it has so much room for what you do with the chords. In music, you'll have a melody, and then it's up to you as like a music writer, whatever, composer, what chords you want to put under that. And it sort of becomes kind of a fun puzzle when you have 3 notes to go with. Sometimes those notes can be the same, but other times those notes can be different. And then finding a chord that works with those notes in that section, and that's your rhythm guitar line. That's the line that you can make a really cool metal chug pattern or what have you. I think the Pokemon music lends itself a lot better to remixing, especially with guitar. Well, I guess with anything really, but I had the most fun remixing that stuff because of that.
Not long after his excursions into remixing, and well before Crypt the NecroDancer, Jules actually wrote a soundtrack for OSR Unhinged, an indie trials game for the Xbox 360. Unfortunately, his music isn't in the final release, but you can hear the music on his Bandcamp. A lovely little gem of original Family Jules riffs, there's little to no information about it online. So how did he come to compose for OSR Unhinged back in 2011?
That was a weird one. So I was approached about doing a metal soundtrack for a motorcycle game, and I at that point was in love with games like Trials and stuff, so I was super down to do that. But there was already music written for the game, and I guess what they wanted kind of for whatever reason they just wanted a different soundtrack, so they went with me. They were doing it because they were going to do this big re-release because of the Windows Phone was coming out or something, and they wanted to have a release on the Windows Phone. So they had me on board for that. But I don't think my music ever got into the game. I don't know what actually happened with the development process with that, because I wrote the music, gave it to them, and then that was it. And I uploaded the music to Bandcamp as my first original video game soundtrack. That's all I know. After that, I didn't hear from them ever again.
It's a shame, because OSR Unhinged would have been served well by the chugging guitars we associate with Jules. Yet, as I listened to it, another instrument jumped out to me. Personally, I play bass, which is known to get lost in the shuffle sometimes with metal. On his soundtrack for OSR Unhinged, there's some truly great bass playing throughout. Bass is a tough instrument to get right, boasting its own styles and techniques, very different to those of a guitar.
I was always a guitarist, and when I started wanting to record music and stuff for YouTube and pre-YouTube stuff that I was doing, I was always told, I read on all the forums, it's like, it's not going to sound good unless you get a bass guitar. So, I did what every early guitarist does, where they record the bass line on the guitar and pitch it down. You're like, well, that sounds like shit, fuck. I think I went even further. Like, I tried to synthesize bass lines, still didn't sound right. So I eventually went on Craigslist, and I looked for the cheapest bass I could find. Literally, just like I perused through Craigslist and found like it's like $30 or $50 bass guitar. And it was by Rogue, which is a super like low end, super entry level, I should say. In the beginning, I always knew that I wanted to write more interesting bass lines than just whatever the rhythm guitar was doing. I remember there was a bassist in my band who was just like, oh, I want to write more complicated bass lines. I don't want to just be, the meme of metal where the bassist just, is there to fill in the low end. Like, I wanted to make some interesting stuff. And I brought that over to my arrangements for YouTube and stuff where, like, once I started playing bass, I started, listening critically to artists that I liked, and I noticed it's like, oh my god, what is this thwappy, like, groovy sound? And then you find out that that's slap bass, So then you go on YouTube and you're like, how do I slap bass? And they're like, you answered your question, you slap it.
To return to the world of Crypt of the NecroDancer, Jules brought that hard-earned bass glory to Deep Fear Octo Bass, his version of Danny's Deep C bass. Its opening riff is enough to make anyone scrunch up their face with pure groove. It's not too often that bass is the centre of attention full stop, not just in games. So how could my ears not prick up at such funk slapping through my speakers?
If I remember correctly, the original wasn't as all over the place, but I felt that a lot of that soundtrack, the way I was doing it, was all metal lead guitars and chug patterns on the rhythm. There wasn't really a lot of bass focus. So I thought that was the perfect time to, kind of whip out the slap bass stuff and kind of groovy stuff and really like mix it so that the bass is really the center of the attention in that song, which is not something I feel particularly comfortable doing ever, but it was kind of like a fun little challenge for that.
The majority of Aria's Ascent is very faithful to Danny's compositions, with that all-important Family Jules twist. But there was an area where Jules made a daring departure from the path. Crypt of the NecroDancer's third zone plays with switches between hot and cold climates. Danny wrote different arrangements for the same melody to reflect the change in temperature when you move between them. The remix soundtracks do the same, but Jules used rhythm in his cold side to further punctuate the extra difficulty of Aria's gameplay.
Yeah, Danny didn't give me the okay on that until like a week before release, so I was just like stressed. I was like, man, I really hope I'm not gonna have to redo 3 tracks within like a week or whatever. So no, I was really adamant about it because it was a risk that I was that I had my heart in, because when I started working on the Zone 3 tracks, I think that was around the time that Ryan was like, okay, Ryan Clark, the creator of NecroDancer, was saying like, okay, I think we're going to have a rival for all of the melody tracks, which is New Game Plus, and then Jules for the aria tracks, which is New Game Plus Plus. And, he was saying like, aria is the ultimate challenge. At the time, it was a one-hit dead, stuff like that. So I was trying to think, and I was just like, okay, like how can I start like actually thinking about this as a game developer? Because my ultimate goal here is to compose music for games. I was trying to think of it like how do I kind of apply an interesting new breath of fresh air into the actual development of the game, so it's not just me covering the music.
So I was a little skeptical because, like in Zone 3, there's the hot cold and the hot side, cold side, and they crossfade between the two. And I just kind of figured, okay, so what I did was I made the hot side just metal as fuck because it's fire and the devil and all that, and then the cold side is just kind of like an icy, tightly produced electronica kind of thing. And so like it was a challenge for Jules because it's like, well, if the hot side has already been established as like this kind of metal thing, like what is the other metal side thing? So he started doing this weird polyrhythmic stuff.
So in the original soundtrack, when you go over to the cold side, you have this very like icy, staccato-y electronic, electronic music kind of side. But then when you go to the hot side, it gets like rock and metal and like big and mid-full, like lots of mids and stuff. And I was just like, well shit, all I've got is rock. Like my soundtrack's the metal version, so I can't just have like 2 metal sides. So I was like, okay, how do I create as much of a differentiation between those 2 sides, still having kind of a cold feeling and a hot feeling? The hot side was the easiest part for me because I was like, what's the hottest, most just like warmest metal of all time? Rammstein's just like the when you hear that stuff, you just think of like Firefly and like all of those just pyrotechnics and stuff for their live shows. I was just like, all right, that's the influence I'm pulling for these tracks. So all those songs I was just blasting, and death metal, I was just blasting Rammstein at the time to kind of get me in the mood for that. But I was just still like, what do I do for cold? Like how do you make metal sound cold? Something I was listening to a lot at the time was Periphery, a lot of prog metal, a lot of gent and stuff, and like I was trying to think of like, what do I think of when I think of cold music? And I was thinking, what's obviously sleigh bells and all that stuff, but like I thought of really kind of just high treble based music where things are very staccato, they're very quick, and the focus is like scrapey, icy sounds. And I was trying to think of like a kind of metal that fit that, and that was very, very percussive metal, like percussive, progressive metal, kind of like the Meshuggah and stuff like that. Monuments was a huge influence for the cold side. So I was just like, okay, let's just make this progressive as hell. And then that's when it kind of fell into place where it was just like, man, this is the final challenge of the game, you getting through Arya is the final challenge. How do we make it harder? It's like, well, let's screw up the beats. Let's screw up the entire rhythm, let's try to see if we can force the player to have to think about where the beat is, because it's not obvious anymore.
Jules was doing some really crazy shit in Zone 3. It was like 8 in 6, or I can't remember what it was. It was just weird polyrhythmic stuff. And the first time I heard it, I was real skeptical. I'm like, man, I don't know. I mean, I think you should probably just stick with it, with doing like tonal things or melodic things differently, whatever. He's like, well, let me just finish it and I'll show you.
A polyrhythm, as the name suggests, is when two or more individual rhythms are used at the same time, usually with different time signatures or feels. For isolated listening, polyrhythms can be very satisfying, but they can get confusing when trying to count along, tap your foot, or nod your head. This was the exact intention when Jules featured them in his cold side. The player has to apply another layer of concentration in those sections, or the conflicting beats can catch you off guard.
So at every given time, you do have that quarter note beat, but it's in the cymbals. It's always in the cymbals. So if you listen to the cymbals, which is the highest part of the kit, which is where you naturally go to, you'll be fine. But if you start focusing on any amount of the interplay between the kick and the snare, you're screwed. As you progress through the level, especially towards like Anguish of the Frost and stuff like that, you start having these fills that are even in crazier subdivisions. I think you have 5/4 fills and stuff, where you have 5 beats crammed in a measure that's supposed to have 4 notes. And then in the final one, in 3/3, you have 7 notes crammed into one measure. So you have kind of just like this thing that's like not only trying to make you fall off beat, but then the measures that are supposed to pull you to the next section of the music is further trying to throw you off. I was very sure that like if you just kind of get the rhythm of it from those first few cymbals and you just keep that going, it's almost just kind of like those rhythm games where every once in a while it's throwing a little thing at you, but if you can keep the rhythm internally, you're not going to have a problem. That was the whole idea behind that stuff, and yeah, Danny eventually gave me the okay, and I was happy.
when he finally did it, and I finally went through and played it and saw what happened as you went from the cold side to the hot side and back, I was like, I would have never thought of this. It's a way of expressing a difference between these two sides in a rhythmic way, which I never considered. The same way, like, expressing going from electronic to orchestral music in Meat Boy.
The approach that Jules took to Zone 3 shows how a cover can become its own beast, even affecting gameplay in interesting ways. The player's actions and the music that scores them have always been closely tied, but rhythm games like Crypt of the NecroDancer make that relationship more pronounced. As technology has improved, so has the scope of what can be done with VGM. As we heard in last week's Portal episode, interactive and generative music has advanced in big ways, but it's not always done as well as Mike Muraski's work for Valve. Other times it can be awkward, forced, or even worse, buggy beyond belief. Following NecroDancer, where Danny Baranowski's music more directly affects the player than in his past titles, where does Danny stand on the future of VGM to come?
I'm kind of conservative on this issue. I love technology, I love AI, I love the idea of generative music, all this kind of stuff. But there are certainly great examples of generative soundtracks, like Spore, Mini Metro, a Disaster Piece. And it's an amazing achievement. It absolutely scores the game, and I don't have anything against it, but it's not musically interesting to me, because if everything's locked to like an octatonic or a pentatonic scale, like there are no wrong notes, and I like wrong notes. So like on the broad level, there's a spectrum there, right? From completely generative to completely non-generative, right? We're dealing with this on some of the games we're working on right now, where we're having to make this decision of like how interactive we want to be, and it's just like, okay, well, can we change instruments here, do this, do that? So there's a practical concern in that once you have, okay, there's a different instrument for every faction, and there's 5 factions, and there's 10 tracks. Okay, so do the math. You start getting to it where it's just not practical.
It's definitely possible for generative music to work beautifully. The aforementioned Portal 2 has examples of it. Left 4 Dead was among the first to get it right, and even No Man's Sky received critical acclaim for its procedural soundtrack by 65 Days of Static and Paul Weir. Conversely, in a rush for increased immersion, such a score can soon trip up on itself and break you out of the world with a few clumsy transitions. A rigid score seems more limited on paper, but lets you explore compositional corners that generative music can't yet reach.
I love the idea of completely interactive, non-awkward music that will stay harmonically appropriate and melodically appropriate, scoring different things. I think that's the holy grail. I think someday, after the singularity, when we're all living in pods, an AI will know how to do that, right? And maybe in our lifetime, when I'm an old man, you could just say, hey, write me a song like this, and it'll just do it. And humans will be completely unnecessary in every task, and that's terrifying, but that's another conversation. I think the way I think of it is like this spectrum, no interactivity on the left, completely interactive on the right. If I had to draw myself on that spectrum, it would be slightly left of center.
None of Crypt of the NecroDancer's soundtrack by Danny or Jules is procedurally generated. In fact, to invent a program that could output Danny B's style of music on its own would be quite the money spinner. NecroDancer represents some of his best work to date, and its avalanche of remixed soundtracks keep finding interesting ways to repackage Danny's founding compositions. Aria's Ascent wouldn't have been possible if the game's tunes were generative, but throughout, Jules exposes the immortal melodic power of Danny Baranowski through his guitar.
90% of the time, I feel like it's so much more beneficial to have a nice, well-scored, well-considered piece of music written for this situation, this set of potential events, right? That I'm absolutely biased for that because that's what I'm good at and that's what I do. But if I try to be as objective as I can, I don't think technology is there yet. Very rarely have I heard a game where it's just like, oh yeah, now I'm doing in battle, so it's doing this thing, and that's cool. More likely, it's just like, well, I'm done with the battle, so the music just cuts off savagely and goes to another stem, and then it fades out and then fades in halfway through another stem, and it's just like, I know I'm a musician, but non-musicians gotta hear this too, right? Like, they gotta hear that it's just stilted, and it's just, which I understand, right? Like, it's and in some cases, it's just, we don't have an elegant way to do this, so we just have to do it because there has to be music, and and that's fine, and I'm okay. I can suspend my disbelief when, like, I'm standing on a ground texture and my character's foot is through the ground. I get that, right? You can't make everything perfect or whatever, but so we'll see. It'll be interesting in the coming years to see how more interactive systems come to be. Again, until that singularity occurs and the robots are making music for us, I don't see that changing anytime soon, but I am so ready to be just like a quote in some magazine 20 years like, hey, you said it would never happen, right? I'm ready for that. Like, cool. I want to be that guy that was totally wrong.
Thanks to both Danny and Jules for their joint second appearance on the sound test, but thank you too for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please make sure to subscribe or follow on whatever platform you might be listening on. Danny will be showing up one more time in this series for an episode all about Super Meat Boy, but that won't be for a few more weeks. The next will focus on one of gaming's most recognisable franchises, Tomb Raider. Joined by Nathan McCree, we'll cover all of the debut trilogy's audio, sound effects, voice acting, the butler's bowels, and of course, the music itself, all get a fair airing, so don't forget to come back next week so you can catch that episode as soon as it's up. All of our Patreon supporters can receive early access for $1, so head on over to patreon.com/_secret cave if you'd like to pledge your support and hear next week's episode right now. Of course, this doesn't apply if you're already a patron and hearing this episode in advance.